And we have some illustrious and wonderful people who are backing Shimon's academic prowess, as well as his very, very fine acumen of mind, and might I say, heart as well. So to have the Honourable John Anderson here to be able to share on this occasion is very, very special. Now, I'm sure that we are all well aware of Mr. Anderson's background, but it is protocol that I should at least in public mention a few items that are there for all to see, but nevertheless, as a result of the background, relish the content. A sixth-generation farmer and grazier from New South Wales, he spent 19 years in the Australian Parliament. He served as Senior Cabinet Minister in the government led by John Howard, and was one of the most successful governments that was ever in Australian parliamentary history. And this included, in his own instance, 6 years as leader of the National Party and Deputy Prime Minister. Very often in my lectures, I ask people to recall specific incidents that took place where they can place themselves situationally where they were at the time of the incident. Major incidents. And one of these is often I mention 9/11, 2001. Where were you at that time? And people remember quite immediately exactly where they were, what time it was, and the like. And in this instance, I refer to that incident also in terms of John Anderson, and I'll tell you why. It was an evening, I had finished a lecture and I had come back to a particular place, a hotel I was staying. I turned on the TV and I watched what I thought was some sort of strange simulation of an event until I realised that it was reality. And the acting Prime Minister at the time, who steered the nation through the shattering terrorist attacks on the United States, was no less than our guest here today, John Anderson, and I associate his leadership with that event in a very personal manner. And I think I might add the most impressive aspect is that when he finally did retire from politics, both sides of the House applauded him in a very personal manner. In fact, Kim Beazley, his political opponent at the time and was leader of the opposition, stated, "I must say, I'm deeply sorry to see the honourable gentleman resign his position. I think that the Deputy Prime Minister has made a name for himself in this Parliament as a man of great heart, a good-hearted family man." Does that not really provide us with a wonderful insight? But not enough. The Prime Minister himself at the time, John Howard, extolled by saying, "I have not met a person with greater integrity in public life." And therefore, I think we're indeed fortunate to have an individual who hasn't stopped his contribution to society and often debates, speaks, and shares insights and thoughts to where we are living in a contemporary world. I'll give you on this occasion, Mr. John Anderson.
Well, Rabbi, thank you very much for that, and to Rabbi Cowen and Maura Deeming, lovely to see you, and your outstanding smile, which I always find a mark of courage and encouragement. And friends, can I say it's a great honour to be with you. Thank you for those kind words. I'm looking around for the person you're referring to. You were so kind. I will never forget 9/11. I have to say to you, it was a terrifying reminder that evil remains a given, even when we try and airbrush it out of our lives. And life really on earth is a constant battle, is it not, between the forces of good and evil. And in many ways, it seems to me that the struggle often centres on who the elites will be. We will always have elites. We will always have leaders. We need leaders, but they can be leaders for good or for ill. And I think it would be fair to say we, the people, cry out for good leadership that will reinforce and draw out our better angels rather than play to our lesser sides. And we're living in a time when, quite frankly, it's very unsure, very uncertain as to who might win out. My father was, like me, a farmer from the northwest of New South Wales, or farmer and grazier. That's significant. Grazing was not a protected industry. Farming was when the Second World War broke out. Grazing because older people could do that. Farming, growing crops and foodstuffs, was harder work. He falsified his occupation, put down grazier rather than farmer and grazier, which is what he really was, when he enlisted in May of 1940. He was to go on and fight in the North African desert in that horrific struggle that took place between 1939 and 1945. He would almost never talk of his role in that civilisational struggle because it was such a horrible one for him personally. On the second day of Montgomery's giant pushback against Rommel in the African desert, he was so badly wounded that the doctors gave him up for dead. He pulled through somehow and came back to Australia and physically struggled for the rest of his life. I'm probably very fortunate to be here. Such were the pressures placed upon him. He wouldn't talk about those events, but in their very dry sense of humour, they used to have some great yarns. And one of my favourite, I can see Kevin smiling. I have a horrible feeling he might have heard me, have you, on the story? Not this yarn, he's being very polite. But one of the yarns from that story centred on two Australians from the desert who were given enough leave to be able to go home or back to Britain for a few days off. And they docked in Plymouth, and being Australians and young and just relieved to be alive and wanting to forget it for a little while, strode out and found a pub as far away from the wharf where their ship had docked as they could, and got themselves absolutely written off. And at closing time, they were thrown out on the street by the publican. The doors bolted behind them, and one of them looked at the other in a sort of slurring way, said to him, "Now we're in trouble." He said, "We don't know how to find our way back to the ship. We're lost." And his mate, being a pragmatic Australian bushman, said, "It's not a problem. This fellow walking down the street will be able to help us." Well, it's an admiral of the English fleet, and he's frightfully upright, and he's covered in gold braid. And they pull him up and say, "Hey, mate, we're lost. Can you tell us how to find our way back to the ship?" To which he replies, "I say, do you chaps know who I am?" And one Aussie looks at the other in dismay and says, "No, we really are in trouble. We don't know where we are, and he doesn't know who he is." And that, my friends, is where our culture has come to. We don't know where we've come from. Because we don't know where we've come from, we don't know where we are, and we seem to have no idea of where to try and strike out to in terms of a better future. Now, my father might not have put it in these terms, but we can see clearly that he was involved, was he not, in a civilisational moment. It could very easily have gone horribly and hopelessly wrong. In many ways it did. 60 million people were to die. Nonetheless, the reality is that the Nazis and the Japanese were overcome, and civilization did not fail, despite the great damage and the carnage that was left behind. And every one of us in this room, I think it would be fair to say, are beneficiaries of that. What were they fighting for? What were they fighting against? My father would have gone very reluctantly, believe it or not. I did too, in terms of public life. I just felt that there was no use standing on the sidelines when I was a young man and I was approached, "Would you run for the federal parliament?" And I thought, well, I've been pretty critical of the way the generals are running the war. I'd better enlist as a private, if you follow the analogy. So I did, and it ended up leading to other things, and it's much the same for my father. But it was important. He turned up. is an important lesson. Not many people, not enough people today turn up. But he turned up to do what he could to fight the evils of Nazism. And I find it remarkable today that we have lost an understanding of the essence of the evil at the heart of that regime. It rose up, of course, in a civilised and educated nation, which is extraordinary in itself. And it centred on pure, ugly, evil racism. The idea of a master race and the idea of a final solution, that some were not members of the human family and should be obliterated. And I sincerely wish that every Australian child would read proper historical accounts of just how gut-wrenching and how unbelievable what happened actually was. And if only they could read the story of the man confronted with Eichmann, was it? Eichmann, when he was finally brought to judgment, and he looked into his face and burst into tears. And he burst into tears because he saw in that man just another human being. Wasn't the evident and apparent evil that he expected. It was his ordinariness and then the reflection that that person was capable of such evil that brought him to his knees, so to speak. So we were fighting a great evil in a civilisational moment. Well, what's a civilisational moment? Just a couple of reflections on what my father was fighting for, what we were fighting for. At one level, you might say it was freedom. Freedom from, if you like, fear of oppression, of a police state, of being silenced, of being maligned, of being mistreated because of the colour of your skin or your ethnic background, from personal anxiety, from depression, from mental illness. And freedom to do what? To achieve your best, to be a responsible citizen, to understand the difference between licence and liberty. Because liberty obliges us to be responsible and to respect others. Licence means that we pursue hedonistically our own deepest and often most inappropriate lusts and selfish desires. And we've, in a sense, over time, come to codify those essential freedoms that belong to us, and the American forefathers had that right. The state should only assume powers given it willingly by its citizens. Can I be rude and say some Victorians, it seemed to me, to be oh so grateful when their governments gave them reluctantly a little bit of freedom back after the lockdown. Hang on, they weren't the government's gift to give. They belong to you as Victorians and us as Australians and as members of a Western civilisation. That's the model. And that might have been encapsulated in the 4 essential freedoms. One, we talk about freedom of conscience and belief. In many ways, that has an unhappy religious provenance. In England, in particular, at difficult times of struggle, minorities were burnt at the stake for their views. And after a while, it dawned on people that that was hardly in line with sound religious thinking. It was barbaric. And secondly, it was very unwise, because today's minority will turn out to be tomorrow's majority, and then suddenly you're on the burning pyre. So we developed the genius, I think, of cooperation based on respect for one another's deepest convictions, even if we don't agree with them. And that's more relevant now, because never have we been further apart in our worldviews, in our culture. Never have we needed a greater ability to respect one another's freedoms of belief and conscience so that we can communicate. Freedom of speech is the one by which we defend those freedoms. We speak up and we talk out and we advance arguments, and we're celebrating the advancement of arguments today. You know, ideas in the public sphere are so important for us to engage in and to debate politely and to respect the adage attributed to Voltaire, although it wasn't his, it was his biographer in the 1930s. I may disagree with you, but I'll defend to the death your right to express your views. And then there's freedom of assembly. There can be no freedom of speech without freedom of assembly. There can be no freedom without our right to discriminate. Have you stopped to think about that? It's painted as a great evil. The right to discriminate is an important one. I might choose to have one rabbi to dinner and not the other. That's discrimination. Isn't it a perfectly legitimate thing? Adam Brandt doesn't seem to want me as his chief of staff in Canberra. That's discrimination. Shouldn't he be allowed to discriminate in that way? Of course he should. Of course he should. And the voters should determine. That's the process our forefathers set up in place, is determine whether or not his discrimination was appropriate or not some kangaroo court that now so dominate. Have you thought about the absurdity of the human rights architecture that we've set up since the 1970s, starting with the Whitlam's Sex Discrimination Act, whereby now we compete with our fellow Australians for our rights. It's an oxymoron. Not love your brother and your sister as yourself and do unto them as you'd have them do to you. But no, you compete at law. This is a nonsense, of course. And then there's freedom of property rights. We forget that one. Mentioned twice in the Ten Commandments. It's the key, isn't it, to freedom. If some feudal overlord's going to come and take away that second sack of wheat that you produced, that you were going to trade with your next door neighbour who can produce sharp knives and you want a knife and he wants your wheat and you both profit by a fair and even-handed exchange, that's a good thing. In this day and age, if you've trained yourself in computer skills or whatever, you have an intellectual capacity and that's your property and you should be able to exchange it, and then everyone benefits from the outcome. Those are the four essential freedoms. Where did this thinking come from? What has shaped us? You see, I'm a great believer in the cultural underpinnings that have given me such a privileged life, and that I have to recognise I've stood on the shoulders of not only men like my father who defended those freedoms, but on those who made enormous sacrifices intellectually, floating ideas, because we're all the products of ideas, and often paid a terrible price for those ideas. I just want to pick out two really interesting little things. Many of you know I do the conversation series, and I wanted to draw out two that you might find of interest, that I find interesting, and so I hope you do. One is that the extraordinary Jordan Peterson, I don't think I need to say anything about who he is. I mean, he's opened up debates that are extraordinary. And we should take note of the fact that it's our young men who are flocking to listen to him. And they're flocking to listen to him because they're really struggling with the fact that their masculinity is constantly written off now as toxic. And he's saying to them, you're not perfect, you're not who you ought to be, but you're not toxic either. So go back to your room, pull your shoulders back, make your bed, get your life in order, and then go out and be as noble as you can. That's his broad message. But fascinatingly enough, I had a conversation with him, a recorded conversation. I almost hesitate to tell you what it was about. It was about lockdowns in Australia. And he was very interested to talk about what was happening in this state. But when we'd finished, he said, have you got anybody interesting for me to talk to? And so I listed off a couple of people that I'd been talking to, which was a great honour to be asked by him. But then I threw in one that I said, look, you won't have heard of a man called Os Guinness, but he's a Christian apologist, done a lot of thinking about the influence of the Judeo-Christian thinking down through the centuries on our culture. Well, Jordan decided to meet him, and then you can find all this on YouTube. He and the extraordinary Dennis Prager, a Jewish scholar from the west coast of America, James Orr from Cambridge, a number of others, to go and sit down for 3 or 4 days and unpack Exodus. Let my people go. Enter into covenantal governance. So much better than contractual arrangements. A contract is limited. And you're always looking for ways to get out of it. And if you're not, the other members are. But a covenant, something you willingly enter into. If you will do, I will do. We will commit to each other. We will cooperate with one another. We will build a society that works. We will understand the concept of subsidiarity, where we will do what we can do for ourselves best, and we'll seek to do the same for our neighbour. We won't push up to the next level in our culture of that which we should do for ourselves. We've turned it on our head. In my 19 years as a parliament, I noticed this stratospheric rise in the number of people who'd come to see you with a problem, and the problem could be as diverse as you can imagine, but it always had the same answer: the government's got her. See, we've inversed it. Does it work? I need not answer the question. It's not working very well. So there is one rich stream of thought that we now are beginning to comprehend deeply informed the founders of America. And they were looking for ways to build cooperation, to build covenantal governments, to rein in the mob, because our scriptures tell us how dangerous the mob can be if it gets it wrong, if it's led, if you like, by the wrong elites. But at the same time to give them choice over who will lead, who will be the elites, who will they follow. And when they lose their way and they get proud, do you ever notice that happening to politicians? When they start to behave as though it's about them and not about us, you can change at the point of a pencil, not the point of a gun. More recently, in an era of history that absolutely fascinates me, and I see Kevin Donnelly here, great historian, great educator, and I know how much work he's put into it, and there'll be many others in the room, our own culture, which we are now so critical of. You know, we thought, as Constantine Kissin put it in London, that the barbarians were at the gate. No, they're not. They're in our midst. They really are. They're in our midst. We now so decry our own culture, we're so reluctant to defend it, that we overlook things that are immensely powerful and important. And I think of the age of the fervent evangelicals in England who were elites. They were leaders. And they had the contact and the interrelationships with other elites. Think of William Wilberforce, think of the Thorntons, the wealthiest family in England at the time, deciding that the slave trade should be ended. Every civilization down through the ages, major civilization anyway, they've all kept slaves. They've all traded in human beings. I find slavery as abhorrent as I find anti-Semitism. I find these things unbearably and unconscionably evil. And so you have this group of people who dedicated their lives. Wilberforce, a man born to immense wealth and privilege, and he put it all at risk and in fact died a pauper, to dedicate his life to ending the slave trade and then slavery. And the others in his ilk who insisted that the British East India Company behave rationally and decently in India, and to reform the parliamentary laws of the day so that they were fairer and less corrupt, and to start education opportunities, the ragged schools as they were known, for the poor. A whole revolution. And we never talk about that now. We stare down statues of people who own slaves and forget to say, well, hang on, we belong to the culture that actually ended slavery voluntarily. And what's more, we decry the idea of empire, and of course it's up and down. It's not all good news. But would you have decried the idea of Britain being the most powerful nation on earth if you'd been on a slave trade, a ship on the Atlantic, which had been pulled up by the Royal Navy, and you'd been set free because the Royal Navy was sent out onto the high seas to end slavery and set slaves free and make sure other countries stopped the grisly business as well? I would have thought you would have been very thankful that someone had used their power. So my point being, for the educators amongst you, you've got to hold these things in tension. Yes, colonialism had its downsides. Yes, empire also had its upsides. And we've lost sight of so much of that. Let me try and draw my thoughts together. As I understand it, in many ways, what you are saying is that people are looking for leadership from elites who will honour them. rather than themselves, that they will honour the people. Australia's longest serving Prime Minister was, of course, Sir Robert Menzies, who came from this fair city. And at one fascinating point, he made the observation that democracy is not so much a machine as a spirit in which no matter your place in society, your wealth, your power, your gender, your influence, all souls are equal in the eyes of heaven. And I don't believe democracy and freedom can survive without that basic understanding, that recognition of the worth and the dignity of every citizen, whether you agree with them or not, whether they have less power or less money than you or not. It should be irrelevant, whether they come from Queensland or Victoria or Western Australia. All those things should be irrelevant. And I salute this. It is now, I have to confess, because I was meant to launch this quite a while ago, a little while since I read it. But what I simply want to say out of it is two things: a very valuable contribution to the debate and a fierce defence of the worth and dignity of each individual, and a powerful reminder that those that would seek to lead should do so in a spirit of service, not of lording it over others. You've done me a great honour, because I'm not a scholar, so you are, in asking me to say a few words today. It's a privilege, and I hope this makes a serious and worthwhile contribution. In other words, it is worthy of making that contribution. I hope it's widely read, and thank you for your work.
Of human society and the condition of its viability. So we have a compass. We don't have to invent it. It exists, and it's been acknowledged and recognised and affirmed. These laws, which my book seeks in various ways to apply to a host of contemporary issues, and I'm sure which are resonant across cultures, they are the lost template or matrix or compass of values which we now struggle to regain and reassert in the face of so much legislation and social policy which have undermined the sanctity of life, the structure of the family and human identity itself, justice, decent economic relationships, a balanced relationship to the environment, religious freedom, and spiritual literacy. These values return throughout history because, notwithstanding these aberrant episodes which we're hopefully emerging now, because they are resonant with the human spirit, which is made in the image of the divine, and the divine which commanded these laws to us. Through the conduct of these ethical principles, the human being actualizes within oneself the divine image. In short, they are recognized by and they resonate with conscience in the human being. That is to say, in the conscience of the human being, which, as Mrs. Deeming has pointed out, where there is a little bit of the requisite humility and self-transcendence, which we find actually more amongst so-called ordinary, simple people than the elites. Because when I say elites, I don't use it only in a pejorative sense. They are our academics, our professionals, our organisation people. But there is an occupational hazard which accompanies their prowess, and that is the arrogance. That is the antithesis of humility. Humility and self-transcendence are requisite for a resonance with these universal values, with an uncovering of the soul, which possesses an inherent connection to these values. So, this is why I've called this book a populism of the spirit, because it relates to the capacity within what we call ordinary people, and high-flying people who have got humility, intellects who share the virtues of the simple people, namely humility, and the humility which uncovers and exposes the human spirit and its resonance with this divine compass, this moral compass. What is needed then is actually to retrieve these values, is the resurgence of the human spirit. So that when I use the word populism, I know that people associate with the word populism redneckness. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about assertion. I'm talking about insistence. I'm talking about resurgence of the spiritual, that which we all possess and that which ordinary people can hear much more readily, and that's why I suggest you might be a great vote winner from the ordinary people. If only you will be heard, please goodness. So, we know that the Prussian statesman Otto von Bismarck said, "Politics is the art of the possible, the attainable, the art of the next best." Well, we may concede to Bismarck that politics may indeed require accommodation, practicality, stage-wise accomplishment of goals. But in the sights of universal ethics, this cannot mean the sacrifice of morality, the compromise of integrity, and resignation before ideals. To the contrary, the concepts of the possible and the attainable expand when one realizes that we work with and trust in the help of a divine providence which has set us these moral tasks. So too, acceptance of the so-called next best, let alone what we see today as the very opposite of the best, evaporates when a populism of the spirit demands that what it and its creator wants be realized, namely the very best.